So you're all very welcome. David and Mary too, and Joanie and Nathaniel, and Jean and John as well. Yeah, it's always good to see you all. So just to remind you what we've been talking about, like the last time we had Joanie and Nathaniel's stories, and that was such a treat. Such a treat, yeah. And actually, just to remind you, they are on YouTube now. Just my little personal channel.
Okay.
And I did send the link once, but I guess I should send it again because it's probably way back before all those songs. So I'll send it again. Yeah, what we've been emphasising lately in an attempt to build a foundation for this church, to really go a bit deeper before we go wider, which is really my goal. Sorry, get this right in a minute. And what we've emphasised so far is, in the last few weeks, is the hearing God. That we might have a real good attempt at hearing God for our lives, and hearing Him to get to know Him as well. It's really, really important, I believe, that so we can have that relationship with Him. And we looked at how we hear Him as we follow Him, as friends and as disciples. We looked at how we hear Him when we first go into the sanctuary. And then when we go into the sanctuary, then He's much, much easier to be heard. We also talked about hearing Him in the mystery. In other words, that He has a lot to say for us, a lot to say to us. And it's not about having all the answers, but it's about the joy of discovering His wisdom and His mystery. And tonight what I want to emphasise is just simple conversation with God. And I'm not going to assume that nobody knows how to have a conversation with God, and I'm not going to assume that everybody does know. I'm not going to assume that you don't know, and I'm not going to assume that you do know, because we all have a very personal relationship with God, but I do believe it's something that in some ways needs to be a little bit more public, because it helps people that are not hearing God very well to actually begin to learn how to hear God for themselves too. So I think it's a really good idea to talk about these things, to talk about our conversations, to talk about how it works for us as we're all individuals. As I'm going to bring out, I don't like this, I'm going to have to pick it up, sorry. Okay. So conversation with God. So rather than assume whether you do know and you do have a conversation or not, what I'm going to do more is give you my experiences of conversation with God as a part of this, because that's all I know. I don't know how you converse with God, but I do know how I do, so I'm going to give you some of my story on that. But just to start with, do you remember, I think it was 2 sessions ago, we were talking, or it might have been one, we were talking about the different ways that God speaks in the Bible. And we talked about phenomenons, we talked about different messengers, like angels and things. We talked about dreams, and we talked about visions, audible voices, prophecies. We went through the word a little and talked about some of the ways that these things happened. And how that really in the Old Testament, really God used the spectacular so much more than He seems to do now. And I'm not saying He doesn't, because I don't know everything what goes on, but it's almost like, gosh, it was all so dramatic in the Old Testament, and yet it just doesn't seem to be that way for us. I'd love to have been like Ezekiel and seen the throne of God coming from Jerusalem into Babylon, and oh gosh, all the things like that. It must have been so amazing. So God used the spectacular in the Old Testament a lot, but the question is, and I'm not going to go deep into this question, but I'm just going to leave it with you. Has Jesus changed the way that God converses with His children? So I don't want the answer, but it's just something to mull over. and we might get there in the end, but is it Jesus that's changed that? But what I want to make a case for in tonight is that, rather than looking for the spectacular in our lives, though that would be brilliant, and I've looked for it. I don't know about you, but I've looked for it from time to time. Lord, do something mighty, Lord. Give me a sign, do something powerful, show me the way. But I need to make a case for the voice. We've talked about the still small voice, and I want to make a case for the voice. And I want to show you why I believe the priority should be in looking for that voice. Okay, and really having confidence in the voice. So, to start with, I'm going to talk about the priority of the conversation over some of the other things, the spectacular things. Now, I'm not negating dreams nor visions. No, have them if you like.
Thank you.
I'd like them. No, I do have dreams, but, visions not so much. But any of those things, God can use them and will still use them. So I'm not negating those. And if you have them, great, it's not a problem. But I do believe that there is a priority of the conversation. And I want to just, for us to just turn to Numbers, and Numbers chapter 12. Okay, and in Numbers chapter 12, I'll just read up to about verse 8. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. I love that.
Don't you?
Yeah. So they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron and Miriam, come out you three to the tabernacle of meeting. So the three came out. Then the Lord came down in the pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both went forward. Then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And many of us know the very familiar verse in Exodus 33 and verse 11, which says that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So it's obvious that Moses had a very, very special relationship with God. And, this is something we just love to emulate, isn't it? This wonderful relationship. And God really wants to relate to his children every day, all day preferably. Why is that? And how is that? And what does that mean? It's going to mean different things for all of us, but, just to know that God, through Jesus, wants to relate to us, and Jesus through the Lord. I mean, Jesus brings us to the Father so the Father can have that relationship with us, but of course it's all through Jesus. Now, the goal is the quiet, confident conversation. Do we have that? Do we have that quiet, confident conversation with God? Do we practice his presence all day, every day? And I know it's not easy to do it all day, but certainly every day. We can manage it every day, can't we? And then things do distract us. So we're not necessarily thinking of God 24/7, but just,
He's thinking about us.
But he's thinking about us for sure. And the more we practice his presence, the more we can be conscious of his presence. the more and more and more. It doesn't have to be just for 10 minutes a day. It can be a lot more than that as we practice it. And I think sometimes that having a regular time and a regular place does help with that conversation. I know for me it is first thing in the morning. Sometimes it's very early in the morning, and it's nearly always the same place. Occasionally in the summer I might go for a walk instead of sitting in the same place, but for me it is often the same place. And when I'm away, I was away the last 2 or 3 days I was in a B&B, and I left my phone behind at my son's house, and I'd got nothing to do in the B&B when I got there. The whole night was going to be without a phone. Have you ever done that? It's the first time I think I've done it for many years, and it was crippling, I tell you. And I tried to sort of spend some time with the Lord, but because it was a strange place, I found it really, really difficult. But, I knew he was with me, I realised another thing as well, and that is how attached I am to my phone. So that was a good thing, really. But God speaks arbitrarily. He doesn't necessarily just speak when you want him to. He doesn't necessarily just speak in that regular time or that regular place. He can listen, but then oftentimes he'll speak in a different time, in a different place. And that's the fun of it, isn't it? And that's the fun of learning to hear that arbitrary voice, and just, it isn't always a voice. And we sang, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord, I want to see you." So sometimes it's seeing something. With God it's like seeing and hearing are so similar, and I can hear something and see it at the same time.
They're all connected, aren't they?
So they're all connected, yeah, and knowing as well. It's great the way they're all connected. So God speaks arbitrarily. Now, one of the reasons that the priority is the voice is this, and that's because when you have dreams, visions, prophecies, that kind of thing, those all require interpretation. And that interpretation can, be difficult. It's like, the Lord said here, I don't talk in riddles. Let me just go back to that to see what actually he did say, because my mind has gone off of that now. 12. Yeah. He says, I speak with him plainly and not in dark sayings. Okay, and some of the translations say in riddles. And that can be the case, can't it, sometimes with our dreams and with some prophecies that, they're not plain. And sometimes years later you've still got that prophetic word on the fridge door, and you're still looking at it and thinking, what does that mean? And I've got 1 or 2 of those that I still haven't worked out quite what they meant, and they might have been given to me by very prominent prophetic people, and I'm still still scratching my head, So those are brilliant, and it's lovely to have them. But when the voice comes, it comes with meaning. And it comes with clarity. And we know, God doesn't speak in riddles, not normally. There are a couple of times which I'm going to, bring out later, but normally when the voice comes, and that's why we need the voice. We need to learn to hear the voice, and we need to learn to hear it regularly, because that is the life with God, isn't it? Is that relationship with him. I'm just going to bring out some of the things that, you have to bear with me, because we're not all the same. And some of what I kind of do in my relationship with the Lord might sound a bit weird to you. And if you shared what you do, I'm sure it would sound weird to me, because we're all so different. And, we all have our individual relationships with him. But for me, the priority is the voice, for a lot of reasons, and mostly, again, because when he speaks to me, he's clear. And that's what I live on. That's the bread that I live on, is his voice. So God tells me how cool I am. Does God tell you how cool you are? Well, if he is, he's telling you. So if you want to hear how cool you are, you just have to open your ears and listen, because he's saying it. God shows me pictures to illustrate things. You know, it might be pictures in my knowing. I'm not going to say that I see things, because I don't know if I do or not, but I do know things. So I might know that I'm seeing something, but I'm not actually seeing it. And he will illustrate the things that I see. He'll also illustrate things from life. I'm always getting illustrations from life, and they speak to me and they guide me. One recently, and I thought it was quite funny, my son sent me a video of my granddaughter. At the time she must have been about 10 months old, and she was trying to eat an apple. So it was a big apple in the little mouth, you know, and she'd seen how her parents did it, so they go. So she had this big and the sound, she made the sound deliberately, and then she dived on the apple, but she couldn't bite it. She just couldn't get that part. But the rest of it was so cool. It was so, you know, dramatic and so precise. And as soon as I saw it, it's like, I thought, yeah, that's just like us, isn't it? You know, in our lives, and especially in ministry and the tasks we have to do, you know. Without God, we just make all the noises and all the effort, and then we just don't quite make it. And we are toddlers in his eyes, really, aren't we? We're children, you know. So that was a great illustration. He gives me scriptures all the time. I've gone through, like, before I was doing this, I went through loads and loads and loads of my journals to see what he was saying to me, and there was a lot of stuff that was literally coming out of the Word, so there were scriptures more or less, which is good. We want him to give us scriptures because, you know, our relationship is based on the Word, and it keeps us from going astray as well. He also addresses my fears. You know, first thing in the morning when I get up, there's often fears. And actually there was a fear this morning, and I just had a thought of a fear. And then later when I sat down with him and began to, you know, quiet myself in his presence, he began to address that fear. And at first I didn't know he was addressing that fear, and it wasn't until I began to see the illustration that was forming within me that actually that's what he was doing, was addressing that fear. And I find that quite wonderful, that he addresses those things that we're concerned about. He tells me of seasons that are beginning, and he also tells me when those seasons are beginning to end. And that is glorious. I mean, sometimes it's scary because some of the seasons, like, they're not great, you know. There was one time we were walking, I was seeing us in my knowing, I was seeing me and the Lord just walking through some muddy water, and my shoes were on, and I was finding it very, very, not very nice to be walking in muddy water. And what he was doing, he was illustrating that, you know, I have to stop focusing on my journey and focus on the destination. So it's saying, you know, your focus is too much on your feet. So little things like that. And then telling me endings. So there was a time when he told me, he took me through a tunnel, and he said, like, you know, I want you to just walk through the tunnel. I want you to be hidden. And that was a period of time when, you know, I was itching to do ministry, and he just didn't want me to do ministry, you know, the way I wanted to do it. He just wanted me to be hidden, you know. And that went on for, a while. And then one day, back in November, a couple of years ago now nearly, I was just literally doing something at the computer. I can't remember what it was. And he just said, get out of the box. That's what he said to me, get out of the box. Because at that point I was in the sound box and doing the sound. And, you know, it just came to me just like that. And, you know, it was crazy the way things worked out after that. So he tells me of seasons that are beginning and ending. He helps me with ideas. You know, all those years that I did life group for 6 years, and a lot of the time, loads of times, you know, I would get up. Well, I mean, I should have prepared before the morning, but, you know, sometimes I'd struggle, and I'd get up on the Wednesday morning and think, I've still got nothing for life group, you know? And then I'd spend that little bit of time with him, and all of a sudden the ideas just poured down upon me, and and it was fantastic. So that's some of my experiences, and I've just got one little more experience to share, because as I say, I was looking through my journals to see if there was anything I could share. A lot of it is very personal, and a lot of it, doesn't make a lot of sense unless you know the story behind it. So I did find one, and if you bear with me, I'm just going to bring it up on my phone. 14th of November 2023. And the reason I'm going to share this one is because sometimes when we're having these times with the Lord, and the Lord is talking to us about things or showing us things, sometimes, I don't know about you, but I can feel like that wasn't God, because I was thinking about that anyway. Have you ever thought that? When he says something, you think, well, that wasn't God, because I was thinking about that. Yeah? And I mean, that can be a little bit of a struggle for us to think that, that would be God if we think it's just our minds, okay? So I was just with the Lord one day, and again, it was just a knowing that I was walking around with him. But as I was walking around, he started to show me some paintings around the walls of certain individuals. He told me that these were men of old that had made a difference in the advancement of science. It was a point where I was really interested in science, and I was dipping in and dipping out of different things of science, because I could see how, science and God were so connected. So these people were neither famous nor recognised in the world, but they were to him, they were to God. So he's talking to me these things. He's saying these men are not recognised in the world, but I know them. They had made some good advances in science. I said, that was nice. I said, but then I said to him, well, I don't know why you're telling me that, because I was thinking of that anyway, so, I could hardly think that it was anything wonderful that you were telling me. And this is when he gave me a little lesson. He asked me to explain myself, and it felt like I only imagined this part of the scenario because of my recent interest in science. So then he laughed a full belly laugh, but it was kind, not like a humiliating laugh. Then he gave me the scripture from Proverbs 20:27. The spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all the inner depths of his heart. He wondered that I didn't realise who put that interest in science in me in the first place, and who stirred it up at this particular time. I am one spirit with him, and so my interests are his, and his are mine, and we desire certain things together. And he oversees my discipleship in him and stirs up things and highlights things as we walk together. So it's no coincidence or a contrived thing that he is on this subject. It's part of our work together. He was telling me all this. I should apparently never think that it's wrong for my previous thoughts to be influencing my engagements with the Lord, as it's quite normal to share things like this together. So, that was probably one of the longest things he ever talked to me about, but it was really helpful because it helped me to realise that, I don't have to negate that he said it just because I'd been thinking about it, because he was putting it in my mind in the first place. We're walking together as a couple, we have a relationship, and if I'm enjoying a certain thing, he's enjoying it too, unless the Holy Spirit does put his finger on it and says, enough, which he's done as well. So, we shouldn't be afraid to, explore things with God. He's a great participator in our activities. We don't rule out the spectacular, but the voice is the priority. And another reason why it's a priority is because of the practical nature of it. So say, for instance, you get offended with somebody in church. How do you deal with that? God has practical help to deal with things like that. You can see, he can actually give you some practical help. When I got offended with somebody a few years ago, he just kept on saying to me, focus on yourself. Focus on yourself. That was all he kept saying to me. And that voice was constant in my head because I needed to just keep focusing on myself and not the person who'd hurt me in this situation. and also the seasons as well. They're very, very important to know the seasons that we're coming into and going out of. And those seasons can be big seasons, dramatic seasons, or they can just be just short seasons. But we need to know those seasons. God wants us to know the seasons that we're in. So that's another good reason. Okay, so the next thing is that the conversation that we have with God is individual. I've mentioned it already, but that we all have a different conversation. You know, we're all individuals. God isn't going to, converse with you like he converses with me. And he won't converse with me necessarily in the same way as you. We have to have our own journey. Now, I want to talk about the Bible just briefly because, we do know, I think we're all mature enough here to know that the Bible is very important in our walk with God. So he will use the Bible to talk to us a lot of the time. And our conversation with him and our relationship with him is based on the word, okay? But the Bible doesn't always talk to us personally. That's why God also talks to us extra from the Bible, because he needs to personalize. For us, we're all individuals. So we don't throw out the Bible, but at the same time, we can have God speaking to us. Moses didn't have a Bible, did he? Nor Abraham. And they had a relationship with God. So we can have a relationship with God, but the Bible is our safe place to go. However, we do get pastors often and priests as well that try to discourage people having an individual relationship with God, because it's kind of scary that they might, go off the deep end, with that. I have a quote here from Dallas Willard. He says, "If our gospel does not free the individual for a unique life of spiritual adventure," you want a life of spiritual adventure? We need to be released into that, each one of us. A spiritual adventure in living with God daily. We simply have, if we don't have that, if we're not allowed to have that, then we simply have not entered fully into the good news that Jesus brought. As individuals, we need to be released into that. And so, it's not the pastor's job to try to prevent that. Especially with new believers, I think we just got to let people go and have that relationship with God, with guidance as well, of course. There's different styles of conversation, aren't there? Think of the people that you converse with. Do you think there's differences in the way people converse with you? Is there, can you kind of pinpoint some of the idiosyncrasies in the way people converse? Everybody's not the same, are they? There are some people that, they just ask questions all the time. They don't really talk about themselves. They just ask you questions. I know one or two people like that,
Yeah, I know somebody.
Yeah.
You can't get any answers out of them.
No, they just ask you another question. And have you ever been in a conversation, this is mainly women, where everybody's just chipping in? It's manic, all the women, they're just shouting in at one another, and they're shouting over one another. But this conversation, as women, we can actually understand that a lot of the time. It's just like a party. It's fun, but it's a great way sometimes. There's a lot of energy in it. And then there's my husband. He will have a conversation. We'll be talking about something, and then 2 days later, he will then go into the conversation again without reminding me of the context. And it's like, he says, and your man, he did this, and I'm saying, what man? What are you talking about? It's like, when we were talking about, that was 2 days ago, So that's another way that some people converse. Then I have a son who he'll say 2 words and expect you to have a conversation with him, It's like, yeah, and keep going, yes. You really need drawing out. So there's those kinds of conversations as well. And then there was a guy I knew, he was a sociopath. And he would ask you a question, and you'd be all excited and back to give him the answer, and then he'd start talking about himself again. So there are so many different types of conversations, and that would be the same with you and God. God will individualize his conversation to how you are and the way that you converse. He's not going to run over you. He's going to be, he's going to adapt, to your way of conversing in order to help you to have that relationship with him. Often, pastors don't want to let people have an individual conversation for fear of going off the deep end. But the other thing to think about on that is they could go on the shallow end as well. So we need to get deep into the relationship with God. That's what it's about. And we mustn't be afraid that people will go off the deep end. And they might, and that's such fun getting them back again, isn't it? And, teaching them how to do it the next time, and, it's all part of it. But we need personal experience, and that sometimes means making mistakes. And I never get it right all the time when I'm listening to God, and I might think I'm hearing God, I'll get it wrong, and I'm sure you guys will as well. I'll get it right too, but I'll get it wrong too. But we need to have that experience, and we need to experiment. We mustn't be afraid to experiment, to think, I think that might have been God. Is there anything you can do to test that? As you're learning, we need to learn, we need to teach one another, but we need to learn as individuals as well. We need not be afraid of getting it wrong all the time. We need to have the confidence to say, I'm a child of God, he loves me, he's going to talk to me, and he's not going to scold me if I get it wrong, and I am not going to go off the deep end just because I get it wrong once or twice. But I need to have that relationship with him. If you really do want that, you're going to experiment, you're going to go after it with passion, because that's what we're born for, is to have that relationship with God. And if we can't hear his voice, and if we're afraid of making mistakes, and we can't hear his voice because the more you respond to his voice, it seems like the more he talks, because you're getting it, you're learning it. And like I said, it's not all just about hearing a voice. You hear when you see, you hear when you know. You kind of get almost that quality of thought that just, it's almost like a revelation. You say, oh yeah, I had one of those yesterday, and I can't remember what it was now, but I get them sometimes, and it's like, oh yeah, it's like, the penny drops. Okay, so then my last point is, there is growth in conversation. And let's face it, that is God's goal for us, is to grow, isn't it? We want to grow as believers. None of us have made it yet. We need to be disciples. And just because we've given our lives to the Lord does not mean we are automatically a disciple. We make a choice to be a disciple. He chooses us, but we need to respond to that. And it becomes a lifelong thing. It's not just a 6-month course. It is a lifelong thing to be a disciple, to be committed to him for our whole lives. 1 Peter 1:13 talks about girding up the loins of our minds. And I think that's one of the first things we need to address if we are really serious about hearing God in conversation, in a lifelong fellowship and discipleship with him. We need to get rid of loose and sloppy thinking. That's what the Bible talks about when it talks about girding up the loins, getting rid of loose and sloppy thinking. In other words, we need to control our minds and what we think about, because that is all so important. We don't want to be hearing our own thoughts all the time. We don't want to be hearing the devil's thoughts all the time. We just want to be hearing God's thoughts, don't we? Yes. We can have a certain amount of influence in those voices by what we put our minds upon, and making that commitment to put our minds upon him. I talked about Bible worship, but there's also something called deconstruction, and a lot of that is to do with how people, Christians around the world, are kind of getting lost, are dropping their faith in the Bible, you know, saying, oh, it's just a man-made thing, or you don't really need the Bible, you know, that kind of thing. I don't know if you've come across it. I have briefly come across it. Very trendy at the moment, yeah. And, you know, I looked into it and I thought, no, I don't think so. I think it's great to have the word, but not to be worshipping the word. The word isn't God. The word isn't the Lord. The Lord is a person. The word is Jesus. But, you know, Jesus is priority over a book. So he is the word. The book just represents what his word is. So we don't worship the Bible, the book of the Bible. We worship the God of the Bible. But we do need the Bible, because that is our tool for it's a guide for us. So we don't throw out the Bible. If we are not growing in the Word, then we're not growing in fellowship, we're not growing in relationship, we're not growing in hearing his voice, because his voice is made up of the word. Even though sometimes he talks away from the word, it will all be, the foundation will be, the word will be undergirded by the word that he speaks, if it's not directly from the Bible verse. Again, a lot of people that are into this Bible deconstruction, they're also into spectacular phenomenons and crazy things, and encounters that are way up there, way out there somewhere, that God wants to give them. And there was a time when I thought, that sounds really nice, I wish I had that. But I was brought back to ground after a while to realise that God can give us all spectacular encounters, but we don't want to go looking for them. We don't want to go after them. We don't want to make that our priority, even though, let's face it, I think we'd all like one. But that's not the issue. We go after God, not after those experiences. But sometimes when we do have those encounters, and I'm not talking about, seeing the throne of God coming out of Babylon, out of Jerusalem into Babylon, but sometimes, we can, as human beings, and maybe some of you have had encounters. I have heard about people that have had encounters, and it might have just literally been, a vision of Jesus, that they actually saw with their physical eyes. Some people have said they've had that. And I haven't had anything like that. So I'm not knocking those things by any means. But you see, those things, as I've said earlier, can be very obscure. And sometimes God does give us those things, but the reason that he makes them obscure often is for our protection. Because if we have knowledge, and if we have those experiences and we're not mature, those things can be very destructive for us. So, we have to realise that God is looking for maturity, and it's often that when we are mature, when we have grown as people in God, that, those spectacular encounters are not important to us anymore. But if we do have them, then we can actually absorb that, we can take that, and God gives them to us for a good reason. But if we go after them, they can be very destructive to us, and they are not clear. They can be very obscure in why they actually happen. So, if we are very immature, we can be unloving, we can be hostile, we can be proud. And if you remember Aaron and Miriam, they were immature because they were giving out to Moses about this Ethiopian woman. They were jealous of Moses, and they just used the Ethiopian woman as an excuse to give out to Moses. It wasn't really about her. It was because, they thought they were super spiritual, and that, they should have the same privileges as Moses in terms of God talking to them. But God knew that they were not mature enough for that. And in actual fact, Moses, if you look at the chapter beforehand, Moses had actually said that he said, I would that all God's children were prophets. I would that all God's children heard the law. So Moses was mature enough to be able to say that. He was humble enough to be able to say, I don't mind. Let Miriam, let Aaron, hear the word of the Lord. So, it showed the difference in the maturity and why that God was able to talk face to face with Moses as a man speaks to a friend, and yet he rebuked Aaron and Miriam. So the closer we get to God, the clearer the communication we will have from God. So it is our goal to get closer to him. It is our goal to grow. What are we living for if we are not living for that fellowship with God, that deep relationship with God, that close, loving relationship with God? What are we living for if it's not for that? So it's really, really important. And when you do get close to God and you do hear him clearly, that is the life, isn't it? That is the life. And I think that, we want our kids to grow, don't we? As parents, we have kids, we want them to grow. But we're not in competition with the next parent whose child is growing. We're not saying, oh, my child's growing more than you. We don't do that, do we? They're all growing at their own pace. And it's the same for us as Christians, as believers, We want to grow, but we mustn't be super spiritual. We mustn't be saying, oh, well, God speaks to me better because, I'm more mature. We're all growing at our own pace. And so we have to have that understanding that everybody is at a different level. And none of us are so spiritual, so super spiritual. And if we think that, then we're obviously not mature, are we? So, discipleship is for growth. And we really need to grow in that conversation. And having those conversations help us to grow as well. Because, if we're seeking the spectacular, that is a sign that we're childish, so we need to realise that. But the mature person doesn't sort of go, get up here and start, telling all the wonderful things that happen to them. They're not sort of, shouting out about all those, experiences they've had with God. It's good to give testimony, definitely good to give testimony, but we need to remember that God doesn't have favourites. He doesn't have people that are there to be above everybody else in terms of their relationship. He wants us all to have a relationship with him and relationships with one another. And sometimes when he is obscure and we think, oh my God, I'm really not getting on well with hearing God because I really don't understand what he's on about. I really don't see what he's doing. I'm not getting any signs. But sometimes he says things or he does things in our lives or he shows us things, but then he gives us time in order to respond to what he's trying to say to us, to learn and to grow and to ask people and say, this is what I think God is saying. I can't understand it completely. He stamps back and he just lets us know he's speaking, but he gives us that time to respond and to grow. And we grow in that struggle. We stretch and we grow in order to receive those things that God wants to do in our lives and to tell us and to speak to us about, and to become that special friend that walks with us on a day-to-day basis. Just that wonderful fellowship that he came to bring us, So that question I asked you at the beginning, has Jesus changed the way God converses? And I just was looking at the Isaiah 42:2 where it says, he will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the streets. And that was a prophecy of Jesus. And isn't it amazing how that still small voice of Jesus seems to be the way that God leads us and guides us? And, it was almost like when Jesus came to the earth, It's like humans finally became ready to be addressed by that still small voice, that whisper. Because let's face it, that's often what it is, isn't it? It's a whisper. And that is Jesus, isn't it? He's that humble servant that, is here for us, for the Father, so that we can have that relationship with the Father. But he's there just as that small, still voice. And we need to get beyond just wanting to have those big things to happen. We need to get beyond looking for signs to make sure that we're all right. We need to get beyond, wanting to hear clearly. God, just turn up the volume. We need to get beyond that and know that God speaks to us through the Lord in that still small voice. And we need to learn to rely upon that small voice and not to rely on signs and dreams and visions, though they will come. But it's not for us to rely on them, because that doesn't necessarily bring us the relationship that we truly need in our lives in Him. It's that steady, familiar voice, that drip, drip, drip every single day. That's what grows us. That's what changes us. That is what our lives are about, is that continual, steady, constant drip, drip, drip. Listen, we don't just believe that God can speak. We need to live like He does. Live like God speaks. Amen.